Dr. Shin Higashi at Tokyo University in Humanism, Philosophy, and Mathematics in the Renaissance.
Yes, thank you, Yoshi, for your introduction. And first of all, I'd like to express my deep gratitude to Professor Ken Nijime and Hiro for having given me this splendid opportunity to share my views with you before such an internationally well-known audience. And I also have to add that some of the research reflected in my talk was made possible by the JSPS, the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science. The same ministry which has funded this our colloquium today. The title of my talk is rather broad in scope. You might expect very interesting material from my part, but let me first say that I will only take some very limited examples concerning this topic. Humanism, I would like to examine some aspects of the relationship between the humanist movement and philosophy on the one hand and mathematics on the other in the later phases of what we call the Renaissance, that is the 16th century. Now, and I've made some slides, some PowerPoint slides, which will help me convey my message to you, I hope. Now, well, as some preliminary remarks, I would like to share my ideas about what I think was humanism. It is a very big question. What is humanism? How to define humanism? Well, my basic idea comes from the famous work by Christeller, who tried to change our conception of humanism about 40 or 50 years ago already. According to Christeller, if I understand him correctly, he defined humanism not as a definite system of philosophy or metaphysics, but rather as a set of loosely common procedures, or rather a kind of attitude toward learning, which became more and more common since the 13th century, the 12th and 13th centuries. That is, Christeller tried to point out the philological methodology, more or less commonly held by, practiced by the teachers of the Studia Humanitatis, grammar teachers, rhetoric teachers, teachers of poetry, etc. So what my principal idea of humanism is having more or less this common attitude, this common interest toward the past, and using philological methods to uncover the rich heritage of Greek and, well, first Roman Latin thought and letters, but increasingly Greek thought and letters. And well, in my talk, based on this understanding of humanism, I would like to focus on what kind of influence the humanist movement or humanist methodology had for later developments in the Renaissance. I contend that its influence was very broad, and not only did it cover strictly topics strictly related to the Studia Humanitatis, but also its influence spread into philosophy proper, principally Aristotelianism, and also into scientific topics such as astronomy, mathematics, and also, thirdly, as well as domains like the philosophy of mathematics, which concerns very epistemological issues. And I forgot to tell you that I am working on a manuscript right now based on my thesis, my French thesis, which will hopefully be published as a book from Paris, maybe next year. Well, I told you the same thing last year. Still working on my manuscript. Okay, well, the first historical figure I'd like to focus on is Petrarch, Francesco Petrarca, who lived in the 14th century. Why I cite this figure, the reason why I'd like to focus on this figure is that although not a figure of the 16th century, nevertheless, he presents us with a case in which humanism had a real impact for philosophy, for philosophical thinking proper. What Petrarch developed in some of his works was a critique of philosophy and science of his times. Well, not only of his times, that is the 14th century, but also the antique tradition, which was very much active in his times. What kind of attitude did Petrarch display towards philosophy and science? Our first problem will be to take a closer look at this problem. There are several works of rather philosophical character in which Petrarch developed his own views on philosophy and science. First, there is his middle work, Contra Medicum, that is invective toward a certain doctor, in which he tried to develop his own conception of what philosophy should be like. We might imagine Petrarch as being a very Christian author. That is, he was rather critical toward a rationalistic understanding of the world, because for him, morality and Christianity were much more important. But that is, in my opinion, that is only one aspect of Petrarch's thinking, because in this work, what he does is to defend philosophy against what he considered were mechanical arts. This work is a polemical work directed against a doctor, a specialist in medicine. What he does in this work is to say that contemporary medicine is not philosophy, despite the fact, despite the doctor's self-identification with philosophy, with the philosopher. Because for Petrarch, philosophy should not be done for the sake of money, nor for the sake of fame, nor for the sake of utility, but philosophy was a search for wisdom. That is, in Petrarch's eyes, that was completely contrary to what the doctors were doing. So Petrarch's conclusion is that doctors should not call themselves philosophers, which was rather customary for, well, in the 14th century, medicine was considered very often as a part of natural philosophy. The second work I would like to cite is his the work of his last years, the De Ignorantia, on the ignorance of oneself and that of many others. This work also shows us aspects of interaction between humanism, Petrarch's humanist spirit or humanist attitude, and contemporary science and philosophy. The De Ignorantia has been studied from many aspects. For example, scholars have often pointed to the influence of Augustinianism, St. Augustine's Christian philosophy, because in many places Petrarch criticizes the pursuit of science as vain curiosity. What does scientific facts contribute to our well-being? That was the fundamental question for Petrarch. For Petrarch, the scientist would be doing a vain pursuit if he forgot that his main interest as a human being should be how to live morally and how to live better as a Christian. What is interesting is that Petrarch was not only setting up this opposition between religion and rational knowledge, because in the same work, Petrarch also displays influences of ancient skepticism. Researchers such as Charles Schmidt has placed Petrarch in the tradition of skepticism before the reintroduction of Pyrrhonian skepticism into European thought in the 16th century. Already in the 14th century, the Academica of Cicero was well known to people like Petrarch. That is one of the fruits of the humanist movement, I think. To be more exact, Petrarch cites Socrates as having said that we know nothing. Well, to be more exact, Socrates is cited as having said, I don't know if I know anything. The only fact that I know is that I know nothing. This citation by Petrarch comes presumably from a passage in Cicero's Academica, the work in which Cicero, the ancient rhetorician, introduces the doctrine of the Middle Academy, which was inclined toward skeptical doctrines. Se nihil scire. And what Petrarch does is to use this ancient skeptical tradition to question the foundations of knowledge. He says that philosophers are very certain of their knowledge, but once we inquire into the real foundations or the reasons for the certitude of knowledge, we are at once uncertain of how science can be, how we can be certain that our propositions are true and reflect the state of the world. So academic skepticism is used by Petrarch as a way of to criticize the arrogance of contemporary natural philosophers. In Petrarch, one of the representatives of early humanism, we have one of the first very interesting interactions between humanism and philosophy. Such influences of humanism will be more diverse, more far-reaching in the centuries to come. Let us go on to some cases in the 16th century. The 16th century, as we know, it saw very interesting developments in natural philosophy, and as Kuni has just shown, developments in the theory of the spirit, of the intellect, was hotly debated. At the basis of these kind of debates was the very active interaction between humanism and Aristotelianism, or to be more precise, the active the activation of humanist methodology in doing Aristotelian philosophy. Humanism and Aristotelianism was the origin of new kinds of debates in the 16th century. Well, first of all, many new editions and translations appeared from the last years of the 15th century onward. Of course, the advent of printing contributed greatly to this new state of affairs. Renaissance philosophers made new translations of many works of Aristotle, and those were printed with the older translations in the many opera Aristotelis cum Averrois commentaries. It wasn't only Aristotle's text which saw a revival in the 16th century, as Charles Burnett has recently shown in one of his illuminating articles. The 16th century was also the age of Averroes' second impact, to borrow the words of Harry Wolfson. The works of Averroes were retranslated, and some works unknown in the Middle Ages were introduced in the Latin language. Another aspect of the interaction between humanism and philosophy and science in the 16th century was new developments in mathematics. Well, we all know the very famous terminology which Paul Lawrence Rose introduced. That is to say, the Italian Renaissance of mathematics. The 16th century was an epoch, was an age of the renewal of mathematical knowledge in Europe. Ancient Greek mathematical texts, hitherto unknown to Europeans, to the Latin audience, were sometimes edited, sometimes translated, and started to change the scientific landscape. The Renaissance of mathematics was not only Italian, because it quickly diffused into other countries such as France, England, and the German-speaking countries, the German-speaking regions. What was the mathematical Renaissance? Let us review its most vital aspect. For example, in astronomy, we have the case of Regiomontanus, who at the end of in the middle of the 15th century, deplored the state of knowledge of Ptolemy in his age, and made up a plan to recover and reprint, edit, recover, reprint, edit, recover, print, put into print the most important works of astronomy. There was also the case of pure mathematics. The 16th century saw the first Greek edition of Euclid, published in Basel in 1533, as well as many vernacular translations of the Euclidean corpus. We also have the case of mechanics, in which 16th century physicians, such as Benedetti, Guidobaldo, precursors of Galileo, and Tartaglia, of course, read and translated or edited ancient works on mechanics, including the case of the pseudo-Aristotelian questions of mechanics, which saw a very dramatic revival in the course of the 16th century. What were the motives behind this renaissance of mathematics? There were several. First, there were, of course, mathematical motives. The scholars were interested in advancing the state of mathematical knowledge in their times. But there were also mystical and pedagogical motives. For example, philosophers were interested in the mystic aspects of ancient mathematics, Pythagoreanism, for example. Neoplatonism and Pythagorean interests were motives behind the efforts to recover ancient mathematical texts. There were also pedagogical issues, because an author such as Melanchthon would say that mathematics is more useful in education than training in traditional logic. So mathematics was expected to be a new way to educate the intellect of the young. Connected with this revival, humanistic revival in mathematics, which of course would be a vital step before the really new mathematical theories of the 17th century, represented by Fermat, Descartes, and later Leibniz and Newton. Connected to this revival of 16th century revival of mathematics was a revival in the philosophy of mathematics concerning epistemological issues. One of the most important events in this connection was the introduction of Proclus in the Renaissance, in the 16th century. Proclus's important commentary on the first book of Euclid's Elements was not known to Latin readers during the Middle Ages. It seems to have been reintroduced into the Latin world by Cardinal Bessarion, who had with him a manuscript when he came to Italy. Now, Proclus would evoke some reactions on the part of Latin philosophers of the 16th century. The first edition appeared in Basel in 1533 as an appendix to the first Greek edition of Euclid, and several decades later, a Latin translation would appear, translated by Francesco Barocchius, who was a Venetian patrician and also a mathematician and humanist. That would appear in 1560. Barocchi had mathematical interests, it is sure. He says in his preface to this Latin translation that knowledge of Proclus's commentary on Euclid would greatly help us in restoring the mathematical knowledge of his age. Well, several years, well, more than a decade before this commentary, we have a very interesting development in the epistemology and philosophy of mathematics. A certain philosopher and humanist born in Siena had published a commentary on the certitude of mathematical disciplines. And this would start an interesting debate on what mathematics is. What is the capacity of mathematics in knowing what the world is like. The novelty of this treatise consists in questioning a long-standing, rather standard view on mathematics. That is...
Conclusion.
Yeah, sorry, okay. That is to say that he questioned the scientific status of mathematical demonstrations. In this text, we have a detailed analysis of mathematical objects and demonstrations. Well, the last thing I would like to have said is that Piccolomini was, in a part, derived his ideas from his reading of Proclus, and his meeting with his knowledge of Proclus might have derived from the Spanish humanist and ambassador to Italy at this moment, Diego Furtado Mendoza. He might have been a link connecting the text of Proclus's text and Piccolomini. But it is not quite certain how well Piccolomini understood Proclus, because Piccolomini did not change his very Aristotelian view of mathematics. So I rushed to my conclusion here. I'm sorry to have taken up too much time. Well, my conclusion is that the influence of humanism was very broad in scope and in the fact that it encompassed many domains in the 15th and 16th centuries. What I try to demonstrate that by taking some examples from this epoch, and as speakers tomorrow will undoubtedly show that humanism had a global impact. It influenced thinking in Japan too, before the prohibition of Christianity in Japan. Thank you. That's all.